Today, what I wanted to talk about was how animism is normative consciousness. And by that, and you, please immediately let me know if the video quality starts going shonky, because sometimes outside, especially if it's going to be a hot day later, come on, join. You'll let us know where you're from. We're talking about how animism is normative consciousness today. I'm lucky enough to be in a kind of leafy suburb of Perth, Western Australia. But one of the things that dawned on me, and I got this idea from an incredible podcast called The Emerald, which I strongly recommend you listen to, the work of Josh Schray. And Josh Schray he talks about animism, and it's his ideas actually, and his language and his example that have helped me steer my mind back, because I'm a student of hermetics. All of the sense making that I do, underneath all of that is a lifelong study of hermetic and other esoteric principles, and which I discovered in the end point down to some pretty basic fundamentals about life. Big up the Kabbalion. Yes, well, a lot of people slag off the Kabbalion as if it's not proper hermetics. And let me tell you what, after decades of study and being prepared to cut away the chaff to get to the kernel, they got to some kernels pretty well. And those 7 principles, I think, are self-evident, and they create a lot of context and meaning for us in our lives if we give them a chance as being true and stop trying to take them too awkwardly literally, and just see the sense making and how they underwrite all of our thermodynamics, all of our physics, all of our human interactions. Everything in the world behaves such ways, and is subject to those same fundamental principles. And I studied hermetics through the work of very serious academics as well. And I don't mean academics that are high on the smell of their own farts. I mean the kind of academics that took the content seriously and didn't, they weren't sort of like the beard strokers on Substack and on Reddit and YouTube that are all pontificating. There goes my internet connection. It's all gone shitty. I might have to go inside. 1 second. Let's see if this works inside. Oh dear. Oh no. Oh, let's see how that goes. Please let me know if this is any better or if it gets worse. Otherwise, I'll switch over and I'll jump onto the other screen. Internet connection is still unstable. Anyway, I'm jumping around a little bit here, and what I was talking about was how animism is normative consciousness. And so I was telling everybody how I got to animism. So in my life, I've had, because of my neurodivergence, I've had this sense of wanting to understand how the world works, how I fit into it, what is the cause of our troubles, how things come out in the wash the way they any religion, any domain of academia or science or psychology. It's not that I didn't want to regard each of them, is that I insisted in some place in myself that I didn't choose. There was an insistence that all of these views on the world should converge onto a single truth. And I don't mean a single simple truth, although, we can get there if we look mathematically and we talk about things like unity. But I do mean a kind of single truth that is coherent, even though each of those lenses that we look into the ultimate truth from, they can be coherent and informed, and but sometimes if you try and move from the humanities into psychology or psychology into science, not everything survived that export or survived that shift. And people would entrench into one silo or one domain and no, this is the only way. It's just just the Pythagoreans, or just Orphic theogony, or just the Kabbalists, or Gnosticism try to pull it a move. And I studied science, and I studied quantum physics seriously. I studied it seriously, and I could see a sense making in so many things in so many ways. Sorry, I'm doing a lot of adjustments of cameras and things, and it's not for the social media effect, I assure you. Um, and I could see veracity in so many things, but I could also see patterns of resonance across so many things. And because of my neurodivergence, I could see patterns that translated everywhere. So my journey went deeper and deeper and deeper into hermetics. And when I say deeper and deeper, eventually I had to leave all of the books and the scholastic musings and the arcane scratchings and all of that, because I kept encountering this question in my heart, which said, so what? So what is the so what of this Enochian magic? What is the so what of all of these claims, these truth claims about the world? So what? What am I as a human being supposed to do with that? You know? Now, people have answers to these things, but none of those answers satisfied me, right? So I kept searching. And I pursued my search of what I would now call Hermetica Reiterated, which is why I have a second Substack called Hermetica Reiterated. And what that is about is uncovering truth that takes away the premise that any avenue of learning can have monopoly on a truth claim. If anyone is pointing or referring to truth or encountering the depth of what is real beyond our perception, and beyond our very, very limited little tiny frame in time and in space, and the tiny spectrum of qualia that human beings can process and make sense of, then it all has to, hey Gary, hey Carol, it all has to be the same. It all has to point to the same truth. And so I shaped and refined and put myself through a very strict is not the right word, but a well curated and very sacred regimen of psychonautics, psychedelic self-inquiry. And my project was not necessarily healing or therapy. It was a therapy of the mind, perhaps. It was a mystical inquiry. I wanted to know what the mystics spoke about and what they touched. I wanted to have that experience inside of myself. I wanted to verify and validate things. I wanted to see and be seen in a way that can't easily be explained in words. Yeah. And in some senses, I had what one might call a lot of success and a lot of understanding. But the problem with that understanding is it wasn't very easy to fold down and articulate to other people, right? And because it sounded so similar, we all draw our language from similar pools, yeah. And because it sounded so similar to what other people were hearing or seeing, they only hear or see as much as they can understand. And then they say, oh, yes, that's what Plato said, or that's what Iamblichus had said, or that's what some other person in history had said. I agree. That's what Nietzsche says this, or Plato says that, Aristotle says this, Hermes says that. And for all my searching and for all my quest for that kind of initiation, none of the teachers, none of the speakers, none of the purveyors of this information were actually creating a path that led deeper into the mystery that also connected with the heart. And so I looked deeper and deeper and deeper and refined my language and got better and better at explaining all those things. And I did some amazing things. One of the things that I did was I did this 6-month study on the what's called the major arcana of the tarot deck. And as woo-woo as that may sound to some of you, it is a profound lens onto like this archetypal vault of meaning that connects astrology and magic and alchemy and cosmic astrology and Kabbalah and mythology and etymology and sacred geometry, and the interwoven nexus of meaning inside of each card is profound, right? And it was at that time that I was finishing up that project that I encountered, because I was still feeling hollow inside. I was still feeling like I'd not been welcomed into the great secret of life. And I realized more and more and more, it wasn't out there in the numinous ether, even though that is an invitation that calls our spirits onwards. It was more like James Hillman said about growing down deeper into life. It was soul work, you see, not spirit work, soul work. And I came to understand that you have to see the human project and each individual, and anything that seeks to actualize, you have to see it as a whole tree. Our reductionist, left brain, modern worldview has enshrined only the idea of the top half of that which we can get fruit from, the shade under which we can sit. Yeah? What I can get for me, the visible, tangible. Yeah. Forgetting that there is an entire experience below the surface where the tree is growing down deeper into life and anchoring itself into life and into soil, involved in invisible processes that have nothing to do with this visible reaching up towards the light and stretching out into the infinite sky. So in one sense, it's an actualization vector, and then below the surface, an integration vector. And I came to realize that the top half of the tree is what we can call spirit. You don't have to lock these ideas or these languages in. It's a way that I explain to students and listeners and people how to understand this whole project. And spirit, then inspiration, aspiration, the spirit that moves things, right? This is of the elements of air and of fire. You know, air is about inspiration and ideas in a very simplistic way, and fire is about transformation and change. And that's half of our experience, is reaching up towards that, you know. And the other half is soul, the roots of the tree and the whole world of it below the surface, which of course is of the element of water and earth, which is of convergent and flow. And it was at that time I realized how deeply and how sterile the spirit of soul, or this quality of soul is in our modern world. And I came up with this idea that said soul is missing. Soul is missing. Soul is that which is missing when life feels wrong. And boy, did life feel wrong. And that meant that it wasn't an opportunity for me to now sit and bitch and moan at the world for seeping the soul out of it. Yes, that's an observation. We have leached the soul out of everything. But more concerningly, right, we are not the keepers of soul. And Rumi said, wherever you stand, be the soul of that place. And so I asked myself, how am I? I'm sorry, I'm just logging into my computer while we do this. How am I being the soul of this place? Wherever you stand, be the soul of this place. And I matched this to this idea that had come to me, an inspiration of words that have downloaded into my heart that said, soul is what is missing when life feels wrong. Soul is what is missing when life feels wrong. So, of course, what I needed to do as a writer is I needed to produce a definition of soul that could survive export, and fold people into a conversation, and then also satisfy both, you know, just normal reductionist everyday humans living in an urban context, as well as people with a slightly spiritual intuition. And so I came up with the following. If I can just damn well find it. And I might even be able to paraphrase it, you know, because I talk about it and think about it so much. It says soul is nothing more than the human thirst and capacity for connection and belonging. And of course, it's not only a human capacity, but from our neck of the woods, from our ability to explain and understand this. Hey, Jacob. Hey, Judd. Just let us know where you're from, Mary and Carol and Jacob and Judd. It's lovely to know where folks are from. Shan says it's really beautiful being an academic when you also have a spiritual inclination, for want of a better word. Studying formal psychology, neuroscience, and computer science with all that perspective makes the bigger picture of why really take center stage. Yes, and we're kindred spirits in that sense, Shan. And folks that are joining, you'll let me know where you joined from. Thank Gary. Gary says I vibe with that. So I thrive on connection here. Folks, don't be afraid to give me love hearts when you hear something that you like, or say something into the conversation. So we're talking about a workable definition. Carol's from Rocky Mountains in Colorado. I would love to get up there, Carol, with my family. That would be lovely. So we're talking about a workable definition of soul that isn't the province of a single religion. That's more poetic. That's more universal. David White says poetry is the language for which we have no defenses. It's a kind of journalism of the soul, I call it, because true poetry has this way of reaching people and crossing boundaries of language and ideas in a place that we all can uniformly experience. And see if you can uniformly all experience the resonance and the context of meaning of what I'm talking about here. So think about how the world is at the moment. We are all individually feeling overwhelmed, right? Like we are not enough for the moment. That's what overwhelm means. We are feeling isolated. Yeah, we're feeling depleted. We're feeling meaninglessness, a malaise of meaninglessness. Yeah, we're languishing under that meaninglessness. We don't have any coherence. And therefore, to me, thank you, Carol. Therefore, to me, if soul is what is missing when life feels wrong, and I'm to trust that kind of language and voice that speaks into the depth of my heart, then it's incumbent on me to go and understand, well, then what is the piece that's missing, right? And then I use hermetics, and hermetics is a wonderful set of principles which invite you to look at the opposite of things to tell something about something else. So, in other words, if I'm sitting with an incumbent problem, I look at how to diagnose that problem by the absences, right? And then I go and look at those things that are absent and I define them. So that's an as above, so below principle, or a cause and effect principle, right? These things are playing out. This is most appropriate at this time for all of us, but especially for me personally. Thank you, Carol. And if you'd like to share why, yeah. Morgan just joined. Hey, Morgan, nice to have you here. So I'm living with this question. Soul is what's missing when life feels wrong. Therefore, what is soul? And I found that out by figuring out what is missing. And so I realized that the opposite to that depletion and isolation and disconnection and lack of belonging and lack of purpose and lack of meaning and lack of vitality, let me talk about all those opposites. Soul is nothing more. Need to mean nothing more. It not is. The actual way I wrote this is soul needs to mean nothing more than the human thirst and capacity for connection and belonging. And of course, it's not just a human thirst, right? It's everything. We live in an ensouled world, in an ensouled cosmos, right? If we haven't noticed yet, nature is an ensouled process. Soul need mean nothing more than the human thirst and capacity for connection and belonging, and the sense of purpose we can attach to the project of quenching that thirst and deepening that capacity in ourselves. I said before, poetry is a kind of journalism of the soul. Soul is nothing more than the human thirst and capacity for connection and belonging, and the sense of purpose we can attach to the project of quenching that thirst and deepening that capacity in ourselves. Soul is the wellspring of our creativity and our imagination, and no less our vitality. Soul, then, is all of that by which we derive meaning in life. And I just want to add one more thing to that, which is a definition of sacred that I work with. Because when we start talking about soul and about spirit and about mystical concepts, we can lose a lot of people who haven't come to these kinds of questions through such doors, right? But my work aims to be a bridge between science and mysticism, a bridge between bridge between the left brain and the right, bridge between the logos of Hermetics and the mythos. The mythos is our encoding of our relationship with logos and our relationship with an ensouled world. And I treat that vocation as sacred, right? I treat my poetry as sacred. I treat my practices as sacred. That doesn't mean I'll walk around in robes, staring blissfully into space, or breathing at people and giving them this beatific smile, because I think that's a kind of performative cosplay that we're doing, But that doesn't mean that I'm not touched by sacredness or I don't recognize it when I see it. A failure to recognize sacredness in things it leads a very poor existence in this life. So this is my working definition of sacredness. It says, sacred, on the other hand, does not need to have anything to do with shared or imposed ideas of religion or God or whimsy. People are throwing the word sacred at everything. Sacred cacao ceremonies held in shopping malls and sacred yoga. I think we've lost the meaning of that. We've watered it down. Sacred does not need to have anything to do with shared or imposed ideas of religion or God or whimsy. It is simply the answered wish to discover something deep. To discover something deep. Where do we discover things that are deep below the surface? Yeah? Growing down into the world, like James Hillman said. What was it? Jung it was that said, a tree can only reach to the heights of heaven if its roots are prepared to grow down into the depths of a hell. Yeah. And Jacob shares that sacred in his invitational understanding is an understanding of a quality of reality itself. Yes. Sacred does not need to have anything to do with our shared ideas of religion or God or whimsy. It is simply the answered wish, which means that we have a question and a desire that we pour out into the universe in our longing and our desires, our deep desires. And then we have an answered wish to discover something deep, foundational, and meaningful about this world and our sense of very private gratitude and belonging that we get from that encounter. And so these are the definitions I'm working with. And the problem and the diagnosis and the synopsis of everything is go out into your access to nature. And if you feel that you are outside of the conversation, that you are outside of the welcome, that you are outside of that cradle or that embrace or that sense of belonging, and you can recognize that sacredness, but you can't feel like you belong to it, and you're petitioning at the edges of that to get in. Yeah. You know that work is soul work, that you need to develop a relationship with place, right? And how the ancients used to deal with this is they used to see animism is normative consciousness is the topic of what we're talking about today. And they had an animistic worldview. They believed that we were all in relationship with consciousness and with intelligence, forms of consciousness and forms of intelligence that were non-human and sometimes not material, but under no uncertain terms were they considered immaterial. They were profoundly relevant and salient, yeah. Now, I come from South Africa. South Africa is a land of colonizers. The colonizers weren't all evil people. They were people that were running away from the yoke of oppression of their kingdoms, of economic circumstances caused by bad management and greed and the rapacious spirit of empire. They ran away from that. And everywhere they ran, the Dutch or the British followed them and tried to fold them back into, back into the crown. And so they left this little tiny corner of Africa and they tried to pioneer and make their way. And like any peoples coming to a new place, especially if uninitiated into that place, if uninitiated into the way of the world, they don't have that conversation with place and with the people that are already there in a way that is integrative, in a way that restores soul, in a way that honors soul, in a way that treats that encounter as sacred. And so they made many mistakes and they caused many harms in their effort to get away from their own harms. Isn't that the story of America? The entitlement that they gave themselves to drive people off their land and to say that they had discovered this new world, as if as if people hadn't been living an entire life and a deep world all along anyway. So my people aren't all wicked colonizers. Some of them were just themselves displaced. They were displaced and they went to a place that ended up displacing other people. And then they ran away from that because they were displaced again, and then they displaced other people. And it turns out, when I look back in the course of human history in Southern Africa, the local Bantu people, the Zulus and Xhosa, that dominated the geopolitical sort of context at that time, they had displaced other people. They had displaced the Khoisan. Yeah, absolutely. Colonialism sucks, bro. But we're having a more adult conversation here. We're lifting the conversation up. We're building a bridge to understanding that can fit all people inside, Jacob. We're all downstream of human error. We're all downstream of human foolishness, all of us. And we can sit and bicker about that and care about who's to blame and whose fault it is, or we can start figuring out how we converge now and how we come together and how we make common cause and how we sing ourselves into each other's stories, right? Because I'm much more concerned about that. And how, if we begin to do that, we can perhaps start to pay attention to the importance of our ecology, this platform that we're all dependent on, that we're having this terribly important ideological argument on, which is focused on victimhood and blame and whose fault it is and what's wrong. And I want to talk about what's still possible from here. What's still possible from here. Now, there are other conversations happening out there, which I'm not going to stop and I'm not going to interrupt, but I'm also not going to necessarily lead with, which is what's wrong and who's to blame. The Earthling just joined, and we're talking about how animism is normative, and how we have this opportunity, and eventually we will realize a duty to find a way to initiate ourselves as individuals and as communities and as a society back into place. Jacob says, yes, endless us versus them stories will only propagate the problems into the future. We need to tell our stories. We need to distill essence from those stories. It was Jiddu Krishnamurti, Shan, who said, it is no sign of good health. It is no sign, it is no measure, he said. It is no measure of good health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick environment or a profoundly sick society. So it's not that we want to stop telling those stories. We want to tell them in a different way. Reinterpret those stories, which is what I'm doing here. I'm talking about the profound human stupidity that we incur even in our efforts to get to a better place. My ancestors did that. And when I did the 23andMe or whatever you call it in your neck of the woods, hello, James, nice to have you here. Let everybody know where you're from. I lost my train of thought. But we're talking about this story of my, yes, when I did that, the ancestry.com or whatever it was, I had a look, and I've got Bantu blood, I've got Indian blood, and I've got blood of European that comes from where Germany and the Netherlands are today. James is dialing in from Nevada, USA. But we all share a common story, everybody. Upstream of our circumstance is the following reality. It's a story about displaced people, displaced by climate, displaced by famine, displaced by circumstance. Displaced people displacing the displaced. We're all displaced, and we're all displacing the displaced. And when you realize the enormity of it, you realize the absurdity of looking for who to blame. But doesn't mean redress is off the table. It means it's not the conversation that calls to my heart. I'm not inside. If I would have a look inside my vocation, deep inside myself, I am not called to do that kind of work. But some people are. Some people are called to do that kind of work, the redress work, the listening, the tending of wounds work. I want to tend to the wound of the whole human spirit and the whole human soul and the soul of the world. Now, part of that work has to be done with listening to stories and pausing our regrets, right? So that we can fold this into an inspiring human story that teaches us not just about who we are, but what missteps look like and what our cautionary tales look like. Right? To inspire us, to encourage us to do better, to do things differently, to do things more wisely, to walk more kindly upon the earth. And so now we have to, as what I'm trying to talk about here is how we individually broker our relationship with place. Yeah, Jacob makes a good point. He says it's very unpopular these days in certain parts of the internet to attempt to humanize people, especially if they belong to a demographic that have to be labeled as oppressors. Yeah, a lot of our race polarized arguments centers around that. And a lot of our social justice discussion centers around that, which is why I lost faith in such conversations. Yeah. Jerry says, that's a realization I have been having recently. I spent the last 2 years working in crisis management and came out burned out and soul drained. And we can't fix all of the wounds. We don't have enough bandages. We need to start stopping the wounding. And you don't stop the wounding by telling people what to do. You stop the wounding by reintroducing them into the common relationship that we all share. It's like my left hand trying to cut my right hand. Right. Which hand is going to do the bandaging? Which hand is going to take the scissors away? We're running out of hands. And the problem is it's the upstream realization that we're all part of one process. And as woo-woo as people think that sounds, you can look at this through genealogy. You can look at this through just the procession of anything that has generations or iterations. We all of our genetics. Yeah. And everything that we eat is a way that we take fruits from the environment and put it into ourselves. Our gut flora, a large percentage of that is non-human. It's non-human DNA that became part of the human story and still is part of our human experience, because the food you eat is digested in the gut. And Jung will tell you, your gut is like a kind of mind. There are chemicals and hormones and impulses that move up through that process that permeate the body, create sensation, create like a in that soup and in that mix and in that process and in that alchemy, there's thoughts and feelings that we encounter. And the real flow of who I am and who I think I am and how I'm engaging with the world, that is an emergent process that is contingent on all of these things percolating up from the subconscious, which are coming from the body and the limbic system, which is coming from our environment, which is coming from our light pollution, which is coming from our chatter, our digital diets, and the food that we eat. Everything is connected. Everything is connected. And it's not a silly notion to think so. So the question then becomes, part of that solution, part of that healing that sickness, when we say soul is what is missing when life feels wrong, part of that has to be the question, okay, well, then how do I deepen my capacity for soul? We've got lots of words to throw at this and lots of ideas, and some of them are brilliant. Into being, Jacob says. Yes, how do we get there? How do we get there? How do we initiate ourselves into such a place of interbeing? In some sense, we can never be removed completely from it because we have a human body, and I wouldn't be speaking to if it wasn't fed and if it wasn't breathing oxygen and if it wasn't taking in energy from trees that had photosynthesized the sun and locked the power of sunlight into its material that I hadn't digested inside of me. So in a sense, you can't remove things completely, but you can poison that environment and you can sever crucial and essential forms of connection and forms of relationship and forms of recognition that eventually transpire in forms of neglect and forms of abuse. One of the biggest ways in which we've become ignorant as a species of that interconnection is our relationship to time, to cadence. We have electric lights and now lights are always on. We have refrigerators and now food is available seasonally throughout the year. Who knows what phase of the moon we're in at the moment? Who knows which astrological sign the sun is in at the moment? Who knows what that archetypally used to mean to the ancient psyche in terms of the light's journey into and out of darkness? Who knows these things? We could be tracking these things, but we're ignorant of them. We're ignorant of them because most of the people talking about astrology and such things are off the charts. They're cosmic budgies having a kind of cosplay conversation. Not to say they aren't worthwhile astrologers to listen to. But the other problem is that astrology at the bottom is talking about the same principle that animism is talking about. And somebody who has a reductionist worldview will say, oh, what do you want me to go out and you want me to go worship trees and hug rocks and pray to a mountain? Eventually, yes, but that's not what I'm asking you to leap into. Let's build a bridge. All right. You need to understand that we live in an in-souled universe and that your soul sickness, right, is because you don't recognize that there is a capacity to you which exists like the tree below the surface. And its nature is anchoring to and connecting with and integrating with all of that which exists below the surface in life. And then more than that, that tree is part of a whole and part of an ecosystem and part of a process. And archetypally, that tree describes you better than you realize. Yeah. So I'm interested in finding ways to initiate ourselves back into place. Right here, right in suburbia, right wherever we are. We can't only remove ourselves. And if you can't do that, sometimes you've got to bring the plants and you've got to bring nature in. And it's as simple as growing some of your own food. It's as simple as making relationships with the people that make your food and grow your food. Even if it begins with just knowing the name of your barista and getting to know them as a person and letting them see the true you on a day-by-day basis. Just that small act changes the way, the entire process of drinking that coffee. We're not looking for perfection. We're looking for gradual, healthy forms of change and awakening that can happen that lead us forward through the heart. Me and my Starbucks staff are tight. I'm sure they are, Jake. But to be serious for a minute, to go to the market and start to learn the names of people that are growing your food and learn about their lives, it changes everything. It changes everything. to grow some of your own food, even if it's just herbs in the window. Yeah. Not all of us can have a lot and escape the urban rat race. We just don't have the means to or the space to do it. But that doesn't mean there aren't things that we can do to reintegrate ourselves differently into nature. To listen to birdsong, to notice that some birds are migratory, to listen out again for the sound of running water, and to remember what that means. Right? To remember that it means that what you are witnessing, what you are listening to, is something that has been part of the same continuous, unbroken cycle of transformation and return of water that has been going on for millions of years. It's not like we get more water, right? There's a finite amount of water. And that water is made up of molecules that keep getting recycled and recycled and recycled and recycled and recycled. And water is memory. Why? Look at your movies, people. Look at Moana. Look at Frozen. These are all about young people breaking the norms that they are ensconced in and finding some sort of connection to ancestors and to spirit and to the cosmos and to nature through the medium of the elements and particularly water. Yeah. Carol says, animism is integral to me and a very, very real part of my life. The wind in the trees spoke to me when I was so young, and it still does. Gary says, I've only recently started to understand what animism is, and I find that it resonates with me on some real level. Yeah, there's some wonderful stuff, and I strongly recommend you go and find a gentleman called Josh Schray. The episodes are about an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours long, but they're slow. They're patient, and they're infused with music and story and song and sound effects. And so everything becomes this old lost art of the bard, where you don't just tell a story, the whole thing becomes immersive and engaging to your thinking, reasoning left brain, but also to this other side of you, your psyche. That's what soul means. Psyche means soul, yeah. Your psyche, which speaks in archetypal language, right? James says, but people so seldom speak of animism. It's amazing to hear this. Lovely to hear, Carol. James says, empathy and compassion cannot overcome incompatible lifestyles. 100%. 100%, James. All of the goodwill and the performative stuff in the world is never going to change anything. Neither is the ideology. We have to literally change what we're doing and become reassimilated back into the cadences, for a start, of nature. It's not just being out in nature. It is honoring those cadences and honoring them in yourself. One of the simplest ways is to recognize what phase of the moon you're in and realize that there's a correlation between those phases of the moon and the seasons that you recognize. There's a time for a spring in a month. There's time for a summer in a month. There's time for a fall or an autumn, and there's time for a winter. There is a time to let the fire die down and let the stones remember their old coldness. There is a time to go and gather fresh firewood out at the edge of the strange, to be connected again with nature. I don't mean literally, I mean this metaphorically. Yeah. Sometimes whatever we're doing, we can't just keep piling more wood on the fire and stoking it into warmth. Sometimes it's choked up with ashes, right? Our processes, our cells become like this. We have to let the fire die down. We have to step away. We have to let things rest. And then we have to clean out that fireplace. We have to make a new place inside of ourselves, inside of our homes, it's at our desks, sometimes cleaning our phones and our emails out, sometimes just flushing out the intensity of the project that you've been carrying that has been dominating you and killing all chance of happiness. And you need to let that die. You need to clean it out again. And then you need to go out and get new things, new poems, new songs, new incense, new flowers for the altar, new kind of food in the kitchen, and a new kind of music to listen to, a new kind of podcast to inspire you. You need to go out and get new firewood and bring it in, right? But you also need to be able to carry back what you go and fetch. Yeah? So you now have to think about organizing. You have to think about just how much I need. I don't need new resources and 7,000 books off of Amazon. I need 3 or 4 that I'm actually going to read, that I'm actually going to allow them to touch me. I'm actually going to be moved by that. Yeah. So now I need to be selective in what I'm doing. And whatever wood I go and get metaphorically has to be able to burn. Or I have to leave it there to dry out. I have to now start thinking about how I'm involved in a process that's going to be cyclic. And then I have to learn how to make a fire, how to kindle a fire. Because guess what, ladies and gentlemen, your fire is going to go out again and again and again and again. There's two definitions of soul that I work with. The one is the hearth, the fireplace in the house, and the other one is the sacred well. The hearth is something we need to tend inside of us, and the sacred well is something we have to return to. Like sometimes we need to go outside of ourselves to go be part of that flow again. And I've got a whole book about that beautiful little journey. It's called The Hearth and the Well. Yeah, you can ask me about it later. But to keep going with that metaphor, it's not any fool can make a fire, you see. The skill becomes in how we tend that fire. So now we need to learn to tend that soul fire in ourselves. How do I tend the fire? How much is enough and how much is too much? There is a equanimity and a peace and a grace and a closeness that we learn to our own life and the sacredness of it when we learn how to tend that fire. Yeah. That means I need to start considering things like a daily practice. That's not performative because I'm part of some tossy spiritual community, but because I need a craft and an art and a cadence and a way of growing down, as James Hillman said, deeper into my own life. And then there needs to come a time in that season, in that month, where it's just for sitting by the fire. No more needs to be done now. Now it's just my time for letting go. And if you do this, ladies and gentlemen, if you do this, you find that there is a way to fit everything that the soul needs. There is a way to fit all of that into a human life. There is a time for doing things with certainty. There is a time for a kind of harvest where we bring home all those things that we've worked on, not just in this little monthly season, in this lunar calendar, in this lunar month, in these 28 days, but maybe in previous months that we've planted like a pear tree, and now it's eventually yielding a harvest. There's time for winding down. There's time for a celebration, a harvest feast, right? Have a special dinner the one night that just clocks all the wins and all the triumphs and all the celebrations that you had. As small as they are to you, they're sacred. And then there's a time for gratitudes. These are not a gratitude journal. These are the kind of profound personal givings of thanks that we make. Our deeply personal gratitudes, things that we're grateful for, the opportunity that we have to do this again. The teachers that arrive in our life, the lessons that arrive in our life, the forms of succor and sanctuary and respite that come, and that we've crafted for ourselves. Gratitude for our own previous wisdom for having crafted a kind of practice and a sanctuary that we can find meaning in. And then there's times for retro, for looking back and asking yourself, as you see, Socrates said the examined life is not worth living, but we didn't ever ask what it was that we were going to examine. And all we need to examine is this past month, this past lunar cycle, since the last incidence of new moon or full moon, or however it is you want to slice it up, and say, if I had my time again, what would I keep doing? What would I stop doing? And what would I start doing? What were my wins and celebrations and my triumphs and my blessings? But also, what were my griefs? What were my regrets? You got to sit with those, yeah? And so then we give time for grieving. And then somebody said yesterday, they quoted one of the verses from the Tao Te Ching that also mentioned, much like that part of Ecclesiastes 3:11 or 11:3, I forget, 11:3 to 8, there is a time for everything under the sun. And there's a time for forgiveness, where you can choose not to forgive people or forgive them again or forgive yourself again. Yeah? And there's a time for deep rest, and there's a time for renewal, and there's a time for emerging now again out of the underworld. And there's a time for hitting that springtime where you can again greet the world in its novelty, and you can do things like with the uncertainty of a spring lamp. Just that lunar calendar that I talk about, and I'll make a post about this and share it on my Substack. This is the way to practice an intelligent form of lived animism that isn't purely mythical, or that you're not looking outside of this, interpreting some mythical context that you can't actually feel inside of yourself. One thing I learned in my home is it's not enough for me to love my daughter. My love has to reach her. It's not enough for me to love my wife. My love has to reach her. It's not enough for me to do any of the things that I claim are the intentions inside of myself. That has to reach that thing that I claim to love. And it's the same with my animistic relationship with place and with nature and with, it's not just going out for a hike and listening to the birds. That's part of it. It's how I honor the cycles and seasons of nature in my life in a real, tangible, lived way that isn't performative, that actually helps me grow deeper into life and helps me recognize the wisdom of the world. Beeson, you joined right at the end. I've been prattling for a long time. I don't know if we got there in the end, folks, but what I wanted to talk about is how animism is normative. And I didn't quite get there. I think I'll have to have another talk about how animism is normative, but the intention of that was to say how it's not a strange, primitive, or provincial worldview. It was the sane and rational response of conscious beings that became aware of their own agency and became aware that the relationship with the world that they lived in and the cosmos and each other wasn't something that just took care of itself. It was a two-way street. Yeah. And that one can enter into a form of conversation with these forms of intelligence and consciousness that doesn't have to be silly. And it can be deeply profound, and it can heal our sickness of soul individually and collectively. And it can reward us with a sense of encounter of the sacred that we don't need to check with anyone else if what we felt was actually truly sacred or not. The way that you feel it, there's no question left, yeah? Not like talking to the trees, much, much more than that, Beeson, but if that's how you get your kicks, then yes, talking to the trees. Jacob says life as something devoid of beingness is a modern mental sickness. Yes, we're saying much the same thing in slightly different ways. Folks, questions, love hearts, anything like that. That cycle that I was talking about, I'm just going to flash a little picture up for you so you can recognize it when you see it. You won't be able to see the detail. It's too small. But it's this little wheel that I've included in the book, The Hearth and the Well. And it makes space for all the things. So it's a little map for a lunar calendar, a lunar month. And it's a small little process that each one of us can start integrating into our lives. It's not effortless, but it's enormously rewarding. And it turns out that if you practice that au revoir, James, if you practice that for a few months, you find it to be a profound healer and restorer of soul. Anyway. Gary says, it's good to see all of you guys as well. How to obtain your book. Carol, if you go to my Substack and you look for The Hearth and the Well, you will probably find an article I wrote about it where I spruiked it. And if I haven't, I will do that. Or I will just post in the chat, my chat on Substack, I will post a link to where you can go get that on Amazon. And I know it's the old enemy. I don't know how to solve that problem because I had to self-publish that book. Emmeline says, oh man, I missed out most of the live. I'm glad I got to check it out this time. Don't worry, Emmeline. I will be taking this thing and recording it and creating it as a post on my Substack so that you can go and watch the whole thing, right? And sometimes underneath there, I also explain what was maybe didn't come out as coherently as it should have on the talk. I provide pictures to what I was talking about so that we can deepen this conversation and maybe continue it on again next time. Just remember, folks, what I'm doing at the moment is I'm reaching out to create a whitelist. It's not only a whitelist, it's going to have a spectrum, but we're looking for nominations, people whose voices we can recognize as game changers, even if it's not their whole voice, even if they just have an idea. We're going to try and get a collection of game-changing ideas, recognizing our torchbearers, our wayfinders for the moment, It's less about art and creativity, although I want to include that, and it's more about ideas that can have an outsized impact on our current soul sickness and our current, all those, the isolation, our depletion, our arguing about the wrong things, all such things. And you can DM me your nominations. Please don't bombard me or spam me with that. I'm going to create a container so that you can all make submissions, and the submissions that you make are all going to be in a repeated format, so that anybody who comes doesn't have to context switch and learn your language and get introduced to your world of ideas, or whichever person you're nominating. We're seeing a standardized way of introducing or being introduced to such ideas, like a little bridge, to say that if you want to create a bridge of coherence into our collective understanding and our collective appreciation, a bridge has to conform to a certain set of limits so that something of meaning can actually be carried across it. And so we need to fold some of our exuberance and some of our expansive language down to what people can appreciate and understand and all relate to. Earthling, Halifax, Nova Scotia, enjoy your work and the idea of the whitelist. I may have an idea for an app, although I have no experience at all. That's okay, Earthling, because what we're looking for here is we're looking for a convergence of ideas. And when one of those ideas inspires us enough, the collective that we're going to form here, that just goes on to a backlog, which gets refined. And then we keep looking for ways to execute or midwife that project into the world. We don't need to know how to do it yet. We can just come with the ideas for a start, so that we can, as Gary says, develop a shared context and start doing something meaningful instead of all just talking about it. Anyway, I love you all very much. Thank you very much for being here. This is getting some lovely traction. It's feeling right. It's a much more positive talk today than yesterday. I was talking about some pretty dark stuff. I didn't release that as a video or a post. I don't want to be talking about that, but I had to say something. Morgan says, I'm tuning in on my evening walk and I enjoyed it. Thank you very much, folks. I'll be back again in a couple of days, maybe tomorrow, maybe Monday. We shall see. And my wife just joined. My wife, meet Dimpna, everybody. My lovely wife, Dimpna, was just at the markets with our 4-year-old getting, because we've developed this lovely relationship, you see, with these people. There's a lady that makes pasta. She's from Italy. There's an old French guy, him and his wife sell farm fresh eggs. There's a guy called Mick, this enormous Australian guy with tattoos. He looks scary as hell, but Maya, our little daughter, has a relationship with him and she gets a carrot from him every week. So it's little things like that, it's where we get our daily bread, literally. And those relationships enrich our meals, and those meals enrich our souls, and we're all become more authentically connected, and it's such a beautiful thing. Anyway, ladies and gents, thanks very much. Dimps folks are saying hello to you. Morgan says hello. Carol says hello. She's the real star of the show. I'm just making all the noise. Take care, folks. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.